Hey biology students, we are going to be wrapping up our last section of evolution by talking about section 2, the fossil record and cladograms. In the previous section of notes, we talked a lot about Charles Darwin. And remember, Charles Darwin came up with the theory of natural selection, or that animals who are more adapted to their environment will survive. Well, a lot of what he talked about dealt with common ancestors and fossils and how he made these connections between these different organisms. So today we're going to be talking about the fossil evidence. One of Darwin's major pieces of evidence to support his theories of natural selection was that fossil evidence. And a fossil is a preserved remain of an animal, plant, or other organism from the distant past. Examples of fossils include teeth, bones, impressions, and by studying these fossils, evidence for evolution is revealed. So we could look at something like this. This is what we call a megalodon tooth. So megalodon was a prehistoric shark that was really, really big, much, much larger than what we even see with a great white. And you can see that gives us a little bit of evidence of the tooth. It's cool because the megalodon, because it's a shark, is mainly made of cartilage. So the only piece of evidence we have is from its teeth, which are not made of cartilage. We also see a lot of organisms like this. That's what most people think of when they think fossils. But we can also have organisms that are preserved, like preserved in amber. So if you've ever seen Jurassic Park getting the blood out of the mosquito in amber, sometimes we can just find their tracks. So all of those are different types of fossils that we can really get a lot of evidence from to help us understand what has happened in history with these organisms. Most of the time, we are going to find fossils in rock, obviously. So in order for fossils to form, either the remains of an organism or some trace of its presence has to be preserved for us to see. And it really takes a precise combination of physical and environmental conditions in order for fossilization to occur. So here we have all these different layers of rock, and we have all of these different organisms that have been preserved inside of the bedrock. And we're going to be talking a little bit more about that in a sec. What happens is once this organism has been preserved, and there's really precise ways that these organisms are preserved, we're going to see that over time, natural forces like erosion or water eating away at some of the rock may expose some fossil-rich layers of rock. So this is where we use something called relative dating. And relative dating is the age of the fossil is determined by comparing its placement in the fossils with other layers of rock. The fossils that are nearer to the surface tend to be really, really young, while the fossils that are buried deeper are older. So when I look at this layer of rock, the way that we use relative dating is these fossils that are closer to the top are the youngest, and the ones that are toward the bottom, these are much, much older. And the reason why we know that is because layers of new rock have fallen on top of these really old ones. And as you get closer and closer to the top, that's the most recent layer. So if you were to go and dig a big hole in your backyard, you would be digging into layers of age of that soil as well. Once scientists are satisfied that they understand what the age of those fossils are, we like to identify how they relate to other organisms. And we also like to identify the common ancestors and to what they are still related to that's alive today. Sometimes they aren't related to any other organism that's alive today because they have all died. Other times we can see some connections. So after Darwin published his theory of evolution, scientists looked for a way to classify organisms that showed phylogeny. So what is phylogeny? Well, that is the evolutionary history of a group of related organisms. So what we're going to use is something like this, a phylogenetic tree or something called a cladogram, that is going to help us understand where these branches are, where the common ancestors are, and how we got to these modern day organisms. The evolutionary history of a group of related organisms can be represented by a phylogenetic tree. We call it a phylogenetic tree because it's showing those connections, and it just kind of looks like branches on a tree, like the one seen off to our right. So we have a common ancestor here for 1, 2, and 3, and then species 3 split off. we have a common ancestor, and then we can see that species 1 and 2 became different from one another. One way of classifying organisms that shows phylogeny is by using something called a clade, and a clade is a group of organisms that includes an ancestor and all of its descendants. So we're going to teach you guys how to read a clade and eventually how to draw a cladogram to help you understand these connections between organisms. Here we have a picture of a cladogram, and a cladogram shows how organisms are related based on traits of ancestors and descendant species. The starting point is a set of data on traits of a group or related species. So all of these animals would have been in this group that was being searched for. And the traits could be physical traits, genetic traits, both. What we're going to really focus on here is physical traits. So what we're seeing is we have this little hagfish here that is at some point related to all of these. But the thing that makes it different from everyone else is a hagfish doesn't have jaws. So we're going to draw that hagfish and then explain why is it different. Next up, we know that a perch has jaws, but it doesn't have lungs, and everyone above this line does have lungs, so that's why it goes next. Claws or nails, so the salamander doesn't have that, but everyone else above does. And that's why we get our lizard and our pigeon are going to be separated because this guy has feathers, and then we are going to continue to branch those off. But we can see that at some point, anywhere where they're connecting to this main line, that is representing a common ancestor. As we go and we want to construct a cladogram, what we're going to see is that we want to decide which traits were inherited from the common ancestor and which traits evolved only in a descendant species after splitting off from the common ancestor. So we have two different types of traits, and that would be the ancestral traits and the derived traits. So traits inherited from a common ancestor are called our ancestral traits. And then our derived traits are the traits that evolved since two groups shared a common ancestor. Sometimes we call those derived characteristics, or a trait that arose in the common ancestor of a particular lineage and was passed along. So when we look here, again, we have our lancelet on the bottom, and then we have our leopard all the way up to the top. When we look at the leopard has hair, an amniotic egg, 4 walking legs, jaws, and a vertebral column. So all of those traits are something that the leopard has. The turtle has all of those traits, but it does not have hair, so it has one less, which is why it's branched off. Salamanders only have 4 walking legs, jaws, and a column. If we go all the way down to lamprey, the only thing that it has in common is a vertebral column. So it shared a common ancestor most recently with a lancelet, but the common ancestor that it had with a leopard is pretty far away. So the closer they are together, the more closely they are related to one another. So this is one of the cladograms that you're seeing from your activity called Investigating Tree Thinking. So if you have this in front of you, great, you can be filling it out with me. Otherwise, you might want to go and print this off or find this somewhere. So if you want to, feel free to pause the video and then come back to this. So I'm going to go through a few of the questions, not all of them, with this first model, but you guys have this model in front of you where we have this line connecting to these two, and we have you, your sister, cousin number 1, and cousin number 2. The first question on your sheet is, to whom are you related? Or more related, I'm sorry. Your sister or your cousin, explain your reasoning. So when we look here, we obviously have you. We have your 2 cousins, so you could choose either one. And then we also have your sister. When we look at how relations happen, it is because of how close you were to having a common ancestor. So if I go back and trace this, you and your sister can be brought back to a common ancestor, and it's just one step. Versus if I'm going to go with cousin 1. So we come to a common ancestor, that was one step. But to get to where you two intersect, that is 2 steps. So that tells me that you are much more closely related to your sister than you are to your cousin because you most recently shared a common ancestor. So who is more closely related to cousin number 1? You or your sister? Well, if I follow those again, we just followed in green that you are 2 steps away from cousin 1. So let's do the same thing for your sister. We have 1 step, 2 steps to where they are close. You're both 2 steps away, so you and your sister are equally related to cousin number 1. And then number 3, this is the last question I'm going to do with you guys. Name one specific individual that might be represented by each of the letters in Model 1. So we have A, B, and C. So if I look here, if I'm looking at person A, how are you related to your sister? That's obviously a parent. Okay, so how would you be related to B? So that is who created your parent. That's obviously your grandparent. And then C would be someone who is from your grandparent but is not your parent. So this would be either an aunt or an uncle to you. So that's how you're going to go through and you're going to read those cladograms. If you guys have any questions, please let us know. Otherwise, have a great day.